Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Admiral Yi Part 4, Those Who Seek Death Shall Live by Extra History. So, last time we saw more naval victories from Admiral Yi against the Japanese. We saw as Yi managed to cripple the Japanese invasion of Korea, despite the fact that the Japanese army had inflicted repeated defeats against Korea on land. I guess we'll see what happens in this episode. Will Yi continue to stack up more victories against the Japanese, or will things turn in a different direction? I am not sure. So, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Last time, we left Yi storming through the waters south of Korea, savaging the Japanese fleet wherever he went. He had driven them first to consolidate their forces to try to thwart him, and then, finally, to give up on offensive naval operations entirely.
Yep, as we saw, despite the fact that Japan had won battle after battle against the Korean army on land in their bid to get through Korea to China, Yi absolutely crippled the Japanese invasion by defeating them multiple times at sea. Japan was having a much harder time getting resources and men to Korea. You know, if you don't control the sea, then you're going to have a very hard time controlling those supply lines. And so in response, the Japanese had basically said that, look, from this point onwards, our navy is going to be purely defensive. We don't need any more offensive engagements, especially not with Yi. All we're going to be doing is just defending our supply lines and defending our route of passage to Korea. That's it.
Restricting their fleets to just defending the vital supplies coming in at Busan.
Right.
Now it was in this last harbor that Yi would attack them. In the 2 months since the Battle of Angulpo, Yi had trained his men, reinforced his fleet, and tried to rationalize the structure of Korean Naval Command. Now, on September 1st...
I mean, Yi is really going above and beyond. I sort of talked about this last time, but not only is he training the forces under him, not only is he a fantastic leader during combat, but, you know, he's coming up with these new types of ships, and he's trying to rationalize command hierarchy within the Navy. I mean, he's really trying to revitalize the entire Korean Navy. It seems like he's a bit more than just a successful general, a successful admiral. Of course, he is a legendary admiral, but he's doing even more than that.
1592, he was ready to take on the combined Japanese armada at Busan. His fleet of 166 ships set out to destroy the nearly 500 Japanese ships awaiting them in Busan Bay.
Yeah, these are massive, massive navies. I mean, as always, Yi is incredibly outnumbered, but he does have a lot more ships than he has up until this point. And also, 500 versus 166. This is a gigantic naval engagement.
He caught a few stragglers along the way, but the Japanese had finally learned from their past encounters with him. They were holed up in the harbor now, and while Yi's ships were able to fire into the harbor from outside Japanese cannon range, he couldn't find an opening to get close enough to achieve the type of complete victory he craved. As long as the Japanese were in that harbor, they were protected by the surrounding troops and cannon on the shore.
Well, I mean, this is what happens when you're someone who pioneers new tactics. You can find immense success initially, but as time goes on, you might find that your enemies are finally learning your tactics and learning how to respond to your tactics, and you might have a bit more trouble. But also, if we think about these great leaders who pioneered new tactics, someone like a Napoleon, or in this case an Admiral Yi, even when their enemies start to learn these new tactics, they can still do pretty well for themselves. I mean, these guys are the geniuses who came up with these things in the first place, so they can usually adapt along with their opponents, even though it might become a little more difficult to fight against the Japanese in this case.
By the end of the day, Yi's fleet had destroyed 130 ships, and the Japanese hadn't sunk a single vessel, but the Japanese forces still held the all-important harbor of Busan. Yi had not been able to break their last line of supply. Now they'd be able to re-entrench and reinforce the harbor. As winter set in and the campaign season slowed down, the situation on the ground changed as well. an army from China had finally arrived in the north, and by January they had driven the Japanese out of Pyongyang. All over the country.
There you go. That's what I was asking in the last episode. I was saying, I don't know what exactly China's up to at this point, but could they maybe send some military support for Korea? I mean, I know the two countries are close, and the only reason Japan is invading Korea is so that they can go through Korea to get to China. And finally, we're seeing some troops on the ground sent from China to back up the Koreans.
The Japanese started to fall back, unable to sustain their lengthy lines of supply due to Yi's bottling up of their navy. By April, Seoul was retaken as well, and Busan served as the last great Japanese stronghold, anchoring their control on southern Korea. By August, Yi was promoted to Supreme Commander of the Korean Army and moved his base to the island of Hansando.
Oh my! So, I mean, this success is really a joint effort between Admiral Yi and those under him, and the Chinese, who have finally sent some troops to help Korea push Japan back on land. Because, of course, before that point, the Korean army and the Korean court was getting pushed further and further and further north, even though Yi was winning these spectacular naval engagements.
Where he had previously used his crane wing formation to crush the Japanese offensive fleet. Again and again, Yi petitioned the court for marines so that he could resume naval operations, because his fleet couldn't attack the Japanese so long as they stayed defended under their shore guns, and without marines, he couldn't dislodge the shore batteries in order to follow up with the naval attack. But the Korean army was still in disarray at this point. Some of the most significant military gains on land were actually being made by guerrilla forces and the righteous armies of Buddhist monks. And
wow. Okay, interesting. So the Korean army is still struggling, but the reconquest of their country is a joint effort, of course, between Yi, the Chinese army, and then also guerrilla forces on the ground, including armies of Buddhist monks. How interesting.
Little of the regular army there was not already deployed on the main offensive with the Chinese was simply not up to the task Yi needed. And so his fleet sat, patrolled the waters, and kept the Japanese from breaking out of Busan. They would not get to engage in another major battle for some time. So instead...
Yi's a man of action. He needs to constantly keep going. He's always working on something, or at least that's what it seems. Though, keeping the Japanese bottled up is still good. Especially if this joint Chinese-Korean army is pushing the Japanese, further and further down Korea. They're going to be trapped in Busan at some point, or at least that seems where this could be heading.
Yi focused on turning his island base into a production center. With the country ravaged by war and most of the working-age men conscripted into the army or the navy, the central government couldn't provide Yi's forces with the food, lumber, or weapons he needed to keep his men fed and his fleet in top shape. So he invited refugees to come to his island. He would protect them if they would work the land. At first they were just producing grain, but soon they were harvesting salt and timber. Then the production
He's got a whole operation going. This is something I've also reiterated a few times now, but Yi is, of course, a great admiral. I mean, you can tell that. We're not done this series, but you can tell that from what we've seen. But he's also more than a great admiral. He's been making efforts to reform the entire Korean Navy. That's more than just your, great admiral. Now he's also putting production. He's starting production efforts. He's bringing refugees to his island. He's doing a lot more than just winning impressive battles, but of course he's also doing that.
Facilities grew to handle boat building and uniform manufacturing. Soon there was a full-fledged R&D wing on the island, and great forges to produce goods of iron. The first truly successful Korean muskets were forged here by Yi's research team. But as Yi was making his navy self-sufficient, the land war in Korea slowly ground to a stalemate, and peace talks began. The talks wore on for 3.5 years, until in September 1596, negotiations broke down, and Hideyoshi prepared a second invading force of 141,500 men to...
My goodness, we're talking about an absolutely monumental number of men here. I mean, we've seen the naval engagements. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of ships, some absolutely massive engagements. This is a gigantic army. I mean, my context for this time period, we're talking late 1500s. We're getting close to 1600, actually. In Europe, that's what I know a little bit more about, armies are getting bigger and bigger as we move from the early modern to the modern period, but still, an army of this size would have been absolutely gigantic. I'm not sure how this compares to other forces in an East Asian context. I'm not familiar with the history of this era, but to me at least, this seems like a lot of men.
Head to the shores of Korea. As this new invasion force was setting sail, the Korean court received a letter from one of the Japanese commanders, in which he appeared to be selling out one of his counterparts, telling the Koreans exactly where his hated rival's fleet would be sailing, and suggesting that if only Admiral Yi Sun-shin would sail there, he could wipe them out and do everybody a favor. Now, Admiral Yi heard this and laughed. Yeah, nice
He's
try.
too smart for that.
He refused the order to sail his fleet into an obvious Japanese trap. But Yi's childhood friend, Ryu Sung-young, had enemies in court.
Uh-oh. Yeah, that's not good. You know, Yi knows that this is a trap, but you cannot refuse those orders coming from the top. Even if you know they're stupid, you're going to get yourself into trouble. But of course, as we've seen, Yi is not the type of guy to obey orders that are stupid. Yi does what he thinks is best, even if that means being a little disobedient.
When they heard of Yi's refusal to follow orders, they seized on this opportunity and had Yi tried for treason.
Jesus.
Yi could do nothing to save him. Yi was ordered to return to Seoul for his punishment. His replacement as head of the Navy would be Won Kyun. This was the guy who'd sat and done nothing when the Japanese ships first invaded, and then promptly scuttled his own fleet.
I mean, like, I get it. I'm sure at this point the Korean government is starting to worry about the amount of power Yi is accruing. You know, he could become a serious rival to those at the top. I understand that. But this is the guy who has really built up your navy, won you all of these victories against the Japanese, and really saved the war effort before the Chinese arrived. And you're gonna do this to him? Can you really afford to lose Yi? You know? With the Japanese promising to send this massive army to your shores? Obviously, there's a lot of infighting, a lot of corruption going on. People are worrying about Yi as a rival. But, you know, zoom out. If your whole country gets conquered by the Japanese, then that stuff is not going to matter as much anymore. You know, your first goal should be protecting Korea. Then you can worry about your petty squabbling and infighting. And frankly, in order to protect Korea, you need to keep Yi in power. He is seemingly the one guy who can do the job.
A fleet 4 times as large as the one Yi had been using to inflict such heavy losses on their enemies. Yi was nearly sentenced to death for his insubordination, but there were still those in court who saw his value, and though they couldn't save him entirely, they did save his life. He was once more reduced to the rank of a common soldier and sent off to fight with one of the armies. But not long after he arrived at the army.
That's crazy, by the way. I'm not sure how it works in other armies, but, you know, I mean, sure, you hear lots of examples of, you know, leaders of different military forces being court-martialed, or, you know, even being demoted, being punished, imprisoned, executed, but being demoted back down to the bottom, I really don't hear about that very much. Now, maybe, you know, I'm sure I think it's a little more common for someone to be, like, kicked out of the army, and then maybe they'd rejoin as a private, but I don't know if this is, like, a Korean thing, or I'm not entirely sure, but this repeated thing that happens where Yi gets up to a high position and then gets demoted all the way to the bottom. Like, not just 1 rank or 2 ranks, all the way. This seems very odd to me.
Army, the Japanese tried the same trick again. They sent the court a letter, this time informing them of a large transport fleet that was on its way, and saying how easy it would be to pick off these transports if they hurried. Won Kyun was ordered to intercept this juicy target, and he immediately set sail with every ship Yi had built. But when he reached the waters near Busan, he was shocked to find not an unarmed transport convoy, but a massive war fleet of 500 ships.
Guys,
Despite
come
this
on.
and the exhaustion his men faced from traveling so quickly, Won Kyun ordered a head-on assault. The winds picked up, and a gale began to form. Won Kyun couldn't keep his fleet together. Soon, some 30 Korean ships were burning, having drifted close enough to the enemy that, for the first time in the war, the Japanese could deploy their preferred form of naval warfare.
And now we're seeing, now that it's not Yi in charge of the fleet, y'all are getting a good look at how difficult it is to command. I mean, any sort of fleet, especially a fleet of this size, you need a very high degree of discipline. You need a really strong leader in that position. Now, Yi has done it very successfully, but as I've mentioned throughout this series, it can be really difficult to get the right organization amongst your ships, to have that discipline, to have the correct communication. These are really, really challenging, and, most people aren't up to the task, and you're seeing here how difficult it is and the consequences that it can lead to if not done well.
Boarding parties. In a panic, Won Kyun ordered a retreat and fled to the island of Kadok-do, where he ordered his men off the ships to resupply. What he hadn't realized was that this island was under Japanese control. As his men searched for fresh water, they were set upon by the Japanese island garrison and slaughtered.
This guy's a
Those who
clown.
escaped fled back to the ships without any of the supplies they desperately needed. Then the fleet just sat there, deflated and listless. Commanders asked for orders, but Won Kyun had none. Though Busan itself was not
This guy is an absolute clown.
far away, he didn't even send out scouts or reposition his fleet. Then, on the night of July 15th, guided by a full moon, the Japanese struck. Won Kyun's forces were in a disadvantageous position. His men were fatigued from lack of supply and demoralized by their loss and the days of waiting. Caught off guard at night and without any sort of plan, they were no match for the organized and coordinated Japanese assault. Even abandoning ship couldn't save them, as those that made it to one of the nearby shores found themselves face to face with the Japanese army, who were silently waiting there for any stragglers who might try to escape, and were quickly cut down.
Now, Yi would have just never gotten them into that position. In fact, that's why he was demoted again, because he refused to get his fleet into that position. But I can almost guarantee you, even if Yi had been placed in a challenging situation like that, he would have found a much better solution. He would have been able to lead the fleet far more successfully. And, that's why you need Yi in that position. You shouldn't be repeatedly demoting him back down to step 1. What is the point of that?
Of the fleet Yi had so carefully built, only 12 ships escaped, saved by one of the sub-commanders who had tried to warn Won Kyun of the danger they faced. 157 Korean ships were lost that day.
Jesus, man! Not only is that a loss, that is a catastrophic loss. You have lost your entire damn fleet. And, by the way, the guy responsible is the guy who was responsible for the same thing happening the first time. How on earth could you put him back in charge, first off? Second off, catastrophic loss. This is this is war ending. That's how bad it is. Fortunately, Yi has been in a similar position before of desperation, and he managed to drag Korea out of it, so if he gets another chance, I'm certain he can do it again, but dude, it's honestly ridiculous how bad this has gone for the Korean forces apart from Yi. Yi has done incredibly well. The Korean army has faced loss after loss after loss until they finally got backed up by the Chinese, and the Korean Navy without Yi is just a disastrous mess.
Including every turtle ship ever built. So with only 12 ships left in the entire Navy, who did Korea call upon? Who else? But mere days after reinstating Yi as Admiral, the court informed him that they were disbanding the Navy.
What?
Yi responded thusly. This humble subject still has 12 ships. However small the number may be, I solemnly swear I will be able to defend the sea if I prepare myself for death to resist the enemy.
Yi thrives under these conditions. I believe he can do it.
And so, they let him. So Yi plotted and pondered where he would make his last stand. This would be it. This one decision would seal the fate of Korea. He studied charts and tides, and finally came to decide on Myeongyang, the Roaring Strait. This particular strait had a strong current, but unknown to the Japanese, its current had a strange property. Every 3 hours, it changed direction. It was upon this unusual current that Yi would gamble everything. On September 16th...
hey, that's home field advantage, though. That is a particularly odd natural feature, but if you're familiar with the local area of your Korean, you're going to know these types of things, and the Japanese ain't. Especially if you're someone as studious as Yi, who's willing to do the work, do the research, you can get a sort of home field advantage like that.
The Japanese fleet, looking to destroy the final remnant of the Korean Navy, found Yi's scouts at the mouth of the strait. They chased the scouts into the strait, and that's when Yi fell upon them. Yi's flagship...
It's crazy because he's got 12 ships. So if he sends out scouts He sends out a couple of scouts. We're talking like a fourth of his entire navy at this point.
Ship dashed into their midst, roaring cannon and tearing through Japanese timber. But his ship fought alone. The rest of his navy, possessed by fear at facing such a large force, had lagged behind. Eventually, though, seeing the havoc Yi's ship was wreaking on the enemy, they took heart. Messengers were sent from boat to boat with a mix of inspirational words, threats, and the hope of victory. And soon, the rest of Yi's tiny armada dove into the fray. Then, a stroke of luck. The enemy flagship was blown apart by friendly fire, and the Japanese began to waver. Some
No
of their
way.
ships began to turn
Guys, you are not gonna retreat from a force of 12 ships. Come on now.
about to fall back. And it was just at this moment that the water's current turned. The strait was too narrow for all the Japanese ships to maneuver around each other, and with the current roaring against them, ships slammed into
Wow.
ships. They tried in vain to retreat, tangled, ships smashing into one another, screams and chaos, and over it all, the roaring water. With the current now on their side, the Koreans gave chase, laying into enemy ships on either side.
I mean, that's just great battlefield selection by Yi. This is something he also seems to be very good at. You know, if you're a general or an admiral or commander of some sort, you want to hold the advantage. And one way to hold the advantage over your opponent is to select a battlefield that is advantageous to you and your force. Yi, in this case in particular, but also more broadly, he knows exactly how to do that. I mean, he is incredibly outnumbered. You know, the Japanese at this point hold every advantage in the book, but Yi still knows how to bring him in. You know, put them in a situation which is somehow advantageous to him.
A hail of fire and arrows. The Japanese boats burnt and sank. 133 vessels had come to crush this tiny remnant of Korean Navy, and 31 of them wouldn't be returning. Yi,
Hey.
even when facing odds of 10 to 1, had once again not
Wow.
lost a single ship. Word of Yi's victory spread. As his tiny fleet sailed, one by one, other ships began to show up. Ships that had been thought lost. Ships that had been...
I mean, Yi's life story is really one of repetition, you know? The countless setbacks he's experienced, whether in the context of him continually being demoted and then working back up and then being demoted and working back up, or, you know, Korea loses its fleet, Yi builds it back up, makes it strong. Korea loses its fleet. Yi builds it back up. You know, this is a man who you can tell is absolutely devoted to his country and devoted to giving his all to improving Korea's chances of winning, because he is willing to do the same thing over and over and over again, no matter how difficult it is.
hiding after the previous disaster under Wonkyun. These ships now came to join Yi's tiny armada. Refugees flocked to where Yi's ships were anchored, willingly giving him food, cloth, and iron. And perhaps most importantly, the Chinese, who had mostly limited their naval efforts to guarding ports until now, decided that they could work with the Korean Navy and to take the offensive. And so we'll leave Yi rebuilding the Korean Navy until next week, when we see the Japanese invasion ended for good.
Wow. Yeah, and I imagine that's quite the advantage, finally having the full cooperation of the Chinese Navy. I mean, you know, we saw how effective the introduction of Chinese ground forces were to this war. Now the introduction of more Chinese naval participation, I'm sure that's going to be a big boon for Korea, and of course for Yi in particular. All right. I enjoyed this episode. It was another one of those where we see Yi knocked down, but he gets right back up again, and somehow, even at rock bottom, Yi manages to drag Korea towards survival. I don't know how he does it, but he keeps doing it. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon, which is linked down below, and it'll give you access to exclusive reaction content. Also, hey, leave a like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. Once again, I hope you guys enjoyed this reaction. I hope y'all are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.